most realistic Godzilla? This question's been a point of many heated discussions for decades now. Is it Tristar's Americanized depiction of Godzilla, or the original Gojira? Does Shin Godzilla, one of the most bizarre renditions of the kaiju, have some of the most realistic properties? We'll be taking a look at a handful of incarnations of the King of the Monsters and comparing them based on which has the most realistic features seen in nature and which is most likely to survive in a real-world setting. But before we get into that, I just want to thank all of you for subscribing to Dangerville and joining 300,000 other residents of this channel that Jacob and I created 3 years ago. We just recently hit that giant new milestone, and we're so happy you guys can come along with us for this journey. But we're just getting started. With Godzilla vs. Kong and Jurassic World Dominion right around the corner, there's no better time to become a resident. Now, let's get to it. I'm Alistair, and welcome to Dangerville. Godzilla has not been a character that's ever been 100% realistic, and that's for a reason. He's a fantastical creature, a king of monsters, both a god and a mutant. He was meant to be an allegory for the abuse of nuclear power, what happens when the ignorance of humanity leads to death and destruction, so being realistic was never a worry. But there have certainly been attempts to make this character more realistic, but what was it all for? Originally, Toho utilized suitmation to bring Godzilla to life, since stop motion was too expensive and time-consuming. By basing Godzilla on science at the time, the design team were able to construct a relatively accurate T-Rex-inspired animal around the build of the stuntman Haruo Nakajima to play the King of the Monsters in the 1954 original. So since then, Godzilla's stance and overall design has remained relatively consistent, sticking true to the classic 50s idea on what a T-Rex looks like. But science advances, and the dinosaurs which Godzilla was originally based off changed completely, whilst the King of the Monsters stayed the same. That wasn't until film producers came up with different ideas on what Godzilla could be, with Tristar, Legendary, and even Toho offering up something different. And it's those iterations that we'll be comparing today. But before we get into which Godzilla iterations we'll be comparing, let's take a look into some of the science that needs to be addressed before we go forward. Based on the square cube law, Godzilla would be crushed under his own weight. Out of water, the bones would simply be unable to sustain their weight, which has reached nearly 100,000 tons of muscle, fat, and flesh. Not only that, but the ground underneath him would cave in, leading to him sinking in the very earth he stood upon. Not only that, because of his size, it would take an entire second for directions from his brain to process through his body, since neurological signals travel at a speed of 100 meters per second. 1 second might not sound like a lot to us, since brain process to us are instantaneous, but it would cause him to be practically brain dead, unable to properly react to his environment, which to him would be moving at a much faster rate. So recalculations based on Godzilla's size has shown us that the maximum size Godzilla can be is around half that of the original Gojira, which stands at 164 feet tall. So in order to proceed with the video, we're going to have to max out Godzilla's height at 82 feet tall, so we can be fair and properly analyze him as a real animal, something that one could envision right alongside the dinosaurs. So to answer the original question, we're going to take 3 of the most polarizing incarnations of Godzilla: Godzilla 1998, Godzilla 2014, and Shin Godzilla. Which is the most realistic? Some of you may instantly say Zilla, although it might surprise you that it could indeed be the least realistic. But why? Let's jump into it by analyzing Godzilla 1998. Probably seen as the most hated design change ever seen in Godzilla history, it's common knowledge that the change left Toho speechless, and not in a good way. And whilst it's grown to be appreciated throughout the years by many fans, including myself, it's no secret that it takes a lot of creative liberties when it comes to redesigning this iconic monster, all with the goal of creating a fresh and realistic version of the King of the Monsters, something Toho themselves would design if Godzilla had been created today, basing it on the science they had at the time. But this design is an interesting one because his origin is that he's an iguana that was mutated by French nuclear tests in the 50s, yet the nuclear bombs somehow turn him from a reptile into a theropod, a completely different animal. Clearly, Tristar was looking to bank off the success of Jurassic Park by making it more dinosaur, less monster, combining aspects from both their velociraptors and the Tyrannosaurus Rex, things we can directly relate to from a visual standpoint. Taking a horizontal stance, having more nimble characteristics, being able to bend and shift around tight cityscapes, and avoid oncoming military fire. This stance allows blood and oxygen to flow properly through the body, which is why we see theropods and many sauropods taking this stance. Though there are a few problems with its design. They took the design of a theropod and increased its size to the size of a skyscraper, without taking into consideration that the animal would need more muscle to stay standing and would require a longer and thicker tail to balance itself out against that gigantic skull. Modern paleobiology has shown us that theropods like the T-Rex require tons of muscle in order to stand and hunt efficiently. The Field Museum in Chicago has recently installed a statue based on Sue, one of the largest T-Rex fossils ever found. And it's currently the most accurate recreation of a T-Rex, which features a more pronounced ribcage as well as thicker, more muscular legs. Gone are the days of shrink-wrapped dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. So in reality, with the muscular build of Zilla, he would only stand at a height of around 6 to 7 feet, alongside dinosaurs like Deinonychus and Utahraptor. But Zilla is obviously much larger than that, so at the scale he is, he would collapse under the pressure of his own weight, with the ankle joint being the main culprit. It would fold like a twig. This iteration of Godzilla also features pronated wrists. If their goal was to create an accurate and realistic dinosaur-like monster, then the hands would need to be facing each other, like recent recreations of dromaeosaurs and even modern birds. They can't quite rotate their wrists like we do. In reality, his wrist would snap if they were bent into that position. And since Zilla is technically a mutated iguana, it would be cold-blooded, meaning he would need to bask in the sun in order to stay warm and keep his muscles active. Though for the sun to be absorbed through his thick scaly hide, he would need to bask in the sun for hundreds of hours at a time. We see a variety of reptiles spending much of their day with their mouth open, sitting in the sunlight for long enough to give them enough energy to hunt. This iteration of Godzilla should be no different. But of course, in the film, it doesn't behave as such. And finally, in the 1998 film, he doesn't feature the atomic breath, and instead has a flammable breath from the rotten fish that he consumes. And all that methane from the rotting flesh becomes of course flammable when it reacts to naked flames, which is actually a really nice detail. Bear in mind, the filmmakers are taking creative liberties to make the monster as menacing as possible, but that comes at a cost of sacrificing their original intent of making the King of the Monsters as realistic as possible. And since they changed the design so much from the iconic monster, it was in the end all for nothing. With just so many differences that make this monster unrecognizable as Godzilla, they should have just not attempted to change it so drastically at all. So for the sake of comparison, we're going to rate each version of Godzilla out of 10, with 0 being the least realistic and 10 being the most realistic. And we'll be judging it based on whether each version of Godzilla could survive if plopped straight onto the planet. So for Zilla, we're going to give him a 4 out of 10, with marks given thanks to the fact aspects like his atomic breath are not present. There was effort put into trying to make it realistic, though it doesn't get more than a 4 due to the fact that in trying to make it more realistic, it has in turn made it more unrealistic. So let's move on to the next iteration of Godzilla. Following the backlash from Hollywood's first attempt at bringing this iconic monster to Western audiences, we got Godzilla 2014, which brought his design back to what fans knew and loved, but of course with some changes to make him more realistic. With more advanced visual effects, they had an opportunity to make it seem like Godzilla was a real animal alongside the characters. So, do these changes make this version of Godzilla more realistic? Well, yes and no. This time around, Godzilla is represented as a highly evolved amphibious creature, the descendant of reptiles similar to the Crocodilia order, not a dinosaur, which means he had flexibility in terms of how they went about designing him. You can tell the hands are influenced by what we see in modern alligators, which can pronate their wrists, unlike the 1998 Godzilla. And in their design, they took care in making sure that this looked like something that you could envision evolving from alligators over the course of hundreds of millions of years. The thing that maybe stands out the most is his bulk, most notably his legs, which this time around take the form similar to that of a sauropod. These legs are far more specialized to carry around heavy weight, something that would definitely be seen on a creature like Godzilla if it were to really exist. The wider bone radius would mean he's able to withstand extreme weights, like what's seen on Brachiosaurus and even mammals like elephants. Talking about his bulk, it's very much realistic. Many fans claim he's too fat or too bulky, when in reality he would need to be. The huge amounts of muscle would be needed in order to move around the extremely heavy joints and properly balance himself. And like whales, he would need blubber to keep himself warm in the freezing temperatures at the lower depths of the ocean. A nice detail that's been taken into consideration is that Godzilla actually has gills, which is a detail that many people forget about. This allows Godzilla to breathe underwater, and as a creature that has hundreds of millions of years to evolve, this would very much be a possibility. Changes like these are found across all of nature, and it might shock you to find that blue whales actually evolved from dog-like mammals all over the course of tens of millions of years, and they became almost unrecognizable, developing completely new breathing systems to make coming up for oxygen far more convenient. Though there are a handful of things that make this Godzilla unrealistic. His tail is far too back-heavy. Godzilla would be dragging his tail around on the ground like a heavy weight. And as discussed, a creature of Godzilla's size would benefit from a horizontal stance, which helps blood flow through the body. And let's not forget that they brought back the atomic breath, which to Godzilla fans is awesome, but it makes him less realistic. To conclude Godzilla 2014, by not basing it off an existing animal like Godzilla 1998, they were actually able to make it more realistic, as inaccuracies stand out far less. By using science to calculate how a creature may evolve, they were able to create a relatively realistic interpretation of the King of the Monsters, without losing the soul of what makes Godzilla, Godzilla. So for Godzilla 2014, we're going to give him a 6 out of 10 on the realism scale, thanks to all the elements from wildlife that have been taken into consideration when imagining whether a creature like this could naturally evolve on the planet. Though it doesn't receive a higher score due to the fact he has atomic breath and takes a vertical stance with an extremely heavy tail. Now let's move on to the last iteration of Godzilla that we'll be comparing today. Next up, we have possibly the greatest change made to Godzilla since 1998. Shin Godzilla served as Toho's re-entry into the franchise after a 12-year-long hiatus, and that came with a variety of differences. This film was intended to act as a callback to the 1954 original, being an allegory for the mistakes made during the Fukushima disaster, a disaster involving a power plant meltdown which led to nearly 19,000 people losing their lives, with more than 160,000 people being forced to evacuate. And with this inspiration, they modernized his 1954 design, being a mangled, mutated, radioactive monster, with no intention to make it realistic. This is seen by the fact he evolves at such a fast pace to adapt to his surroundings, and even evolves to shoot lasers out of his mouth, back, and even tail. Though there are some realistic traits that can be found on Shin Godzilla. For starters, even though he has raised ankle joints, which is less realistic than the sauropod-like legs found in 2014, they're at least much more bulky, which means its muscle would have been more capable at sustaining its own weight, unlike Godzilla 1998. The concept of evolution is also explored relatively realistically here, just in a much faster rate. If this process was to take place over the course of hundreds of millions of years, it's actually quite realistic to envision this creature starting as a fish-like creature before developing primitive legs, becoming more capable on land. This is how we developed after all. But behaviorally speaking, this iteration of Godzilla is perhaps the most realistic there is, acting purely based on instinct, moving slowly without much thought, without considering who or what is being destroyed along the way. By taking one look at his expression, you can't tell what his intentions are or what he's thinking, just like a real reptilian animal. And like cold-blooded reptiles, he also has to stop and absorb energy through his surroundings for long periods of time in order to keep active. But instead of sunlight, in its place is radiation. But the fact they added this behavior makes it closer to what we see in the animal kingdom. If we were to remove the most fantastical elements, such as the fact he shoots lasers out of his tail and evolves far too quickly, he could be one of the most realistic iterations of the King of the Monsters out there, which may surprise many of you. But due to the fact his physique doesn't resemble anything one might find in nature, alongside the fact he has many fantastical elements, holds this iteration back from being more realistic than 2014. However, thanks to the realistic mannerisms and the fact it wasn't tied down to an existing animal, allows it to be more realistic than 1998. So since Shin Godzilla is a bit of a confusing specimen, we'll give him 2 ratings. If we were to rate him as presented in the film, he'll get a -10 out of 10 due to the rapid evolution, raised ankles, vertical stance, and larger-than-life tail, and ability to shoot lasers. But if we were to take his abilities away and look at him in his final form, we'd have to give him a 5 out of 10, thanks to the way he behaves and the thicker physique that allows him to walk on land efficiently. And the attention to detail in its representation of evolution is commendable, even if it takes place far too quickly. Though after all, he truly is a god incarnate. After taking a look at 3 of the most polarizing designs for Godzilla, we're able to come to a conclusion on which one is the most realistic, and the results may be a shock to you. The answer to the question is Godzilla 1967, and that's because, that's a joke. The most realistic Godzilla is actually the legendary version of the character, thanks to the fact it doesn't limit itself to science of the time by attempting to be a dinosaur. Instead, it takes creative liberties and examines what a creature like an alligator could evolve into, depending on the environment it's in. It features pronated wrists, thicker legs, and overall hide, with thick skin and blubber to keep itself warm in the ocean, as well as a well-proportioned head and even gills. There was a lot of details that the design team put into legendary Goji to make sure it felt real, and it paid off, and exceeded where 1998 Godzilla failed. This design has been modified slightly over the course of the movies and comic books, which in turn made him slightly less realistic, with bendable dorsal plates, which are meant to be connected to the spinal column, as well as more pronounced feet, which would snap under the pressure when walking. So as it stands, Godzilla 2014 is the most realistic interpretation of the King of the Monsters. But it doesn't mean that it's the best design. That's down to you, the fan. Each of these designs have something unique to offer, whether that's realism, pure terror, or something a bit more dinosaur-like. There's something to take away from each of them, so tell us, which one is your most favorite design? And what do you think of legendary Goji being the most realistic interpretation of this iconic monster? Let us know in the comment section down below. If you want to see more comparisons like this, then like this video because it helps us know what you want to see more of. And once again, thanks to 300,000 subscribers for joining us on this journey. We're only just getting started. If you want to come along for the ride, then subscribe and stomp that notification button to become a resident of our lovely town of Dangerville today. I've been Alistair, and we'll see you residents in the next one.